Welcome to the Shadow of History channel. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out more videos like this one.
In the summer of 1939, the world's most celebrated physicist, Albert Einstein, paused from the weight of a darkening world to sit quietly with his stepdaughter Margot at the opening of the Jewish Pavilion at the World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, New York. At a California school in 1942, an ordinary boy eats his lunch unaware that Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, would soon imprison him and thousands of Japanese American families in camps across the United States. In the jungles of Vietnam in 1967, a U.S. soldier holds what appears to be a 2-foot centipede, though the creature is only 10 inches long, a trick of forced perspective with the insect dangled on a fishing string deliberately close to the camera lens. In October 1963, just weeks before his assassination, President John F. Kennedy shared a quiet moment with his young son, JFK Jr., on the grounds of the White House, a fleeting portrait of a father and a presidency nearing its end. Standing as the world's largest log cabin when photographed in Portland, Oregon, in 1938, this remarkable structure was built in 1905 as a testament to the American West and would be lost forever when it burned to the ground in 1964. Found near a German concentration camp in 1945, these wedding rings, removed from Holocaust victims before their execution, stand today as one of the most haunting and enduring symbols of the 6 million lives extinguished by Nazi terror. In the early 20th century, Jean Libera, known as the double-bodied man, performed in sideshows across the world, carrying his parasitic twin Jacques fused to his chest, while living a remarkably full life, a loving marriage, and 4 healthy children of his own. By 1920, the Michelin Man had become the face of a tire empire that quietly transformed the way the world ate. Michelin began publishing restaurant guides to encourage longer drives, wearing tires down faster, and so the famous star rating system for dining was born. The Swedish warship Vasa sank in 1628, less than a mile into her maiden voyage, resting silently on the seafloor for 33 years before being raised almost completely intact and finding her permanent home at the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden. In 1987, heart surgeon Dr. Zbigniew Religa collapsed exhausted after completing Poland's first successful heart transplant in a grueling 23-hour operation, his assistant asleep in the corner, while his patient, Tadeusz Zytkiewicz, lived on for 30 more years, outliving the very doctor who gave him a new heart. As smoke rose over Manhattan on the 11th of September 2001, a Lone Ups worker continued moving through the streets of New York, delivering packages amid the chaos, a quiet image of ordinary duty carried out in the middle of an extraordinary and devastating day. In 1936, a bold architectural proposal envisioned automobiles driving directly onto the second floor of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, a vision of a modernized monument that would never be built, yet captured the boundless ambition of an era in love with the machine age. In the summer of 1945, this single image of Hiroshima stands where an entire city once stood, a landscape of ash and silence left behind by the first atomic bomb ever used in war, a moment that forever changed the course of human history. On the 12th of September 1939, in the Polish town of Kowalski, Nazi propaganda director Leni Riefenstahl watches as German soldiers shoot Jewish civilians, a woman who after the war denied all knowledge of the Holocaust, was arrested but was never charged with war crimes. This is the last photograph taken by adventurer Andrew Macaulay, who vanished in 2007 while attempting to kayak alone across 991 miles of the Tasman Sea from Australia to New Zealand. His kayak eventually found, but Macaulay himself never recovered. In the summer of 1963, months before his assassination, President John F. Kennedy dined at Alfredo's Trattoria in Rome, Italy, one of the world's most celebrated restaurants, savoring a moment of peace in what would prove to be the final chapter of his life. At the Hotel Astor in New York in 1904, elegantly dressed guests gathered for a dinner party that captured the gilded confidence of early 20th century American society. A world of chandeliers and ceremony standing on the edge of a century that would change everything. Sealed inside someone's locket and carried close to the heart, this unnamed woman's photograph from the 1940s is a quiet reminder that behind every great moment of history were millions of private lives, private loves, and faces that history never recorded by name. Photographed around 1860, this elderly man is one of the last surviving veterans of the Battle of Waterloo. A soldier who stood on that Belgian field in 1815 and lived long enough to be captured by the new technology of photography, a living bridge between two eras. Amid the heat, the jungle, and the weight of an unwinnable war, this image from Vietnam carries in its silence everything that words struggle to say: the exhaustion, the youth, and the quiet endurance of soldiers caught inside a conflict that would define a generation. Paris traffic 1912, long before traffic lights or paved highways, horses, carriages, and early automobiles competed for the same cobblestone streets in a city already outgrowing the world that built it. Dressed in his Union uniform and photographed in Missouri in 1863, this young soldier stares into a camera lens during the bloodiest war America had ever fought. A portrait of duty worn on a face still too young to carry it. Before the Environmental Protection Agency existed, New York City in 1966 choked beneath skies thick with industrial smog, a city of millions breathing air that no government agency yet had the legal power to clean. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, and President-elect George H.W. Bush stood together at a moment when the Cold War was quietly ending, and today, all 5 people photographed in that room are gone. As Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of Czechoslovakia during the 1968 invasion, a young couple in wedding clothes stood frozen in their path. 2 people who chose that day to begin a life together, only to find history arriving uninvited. In 1970, a New York City police officer knelt on a sidewalk to play Duck Duck Goose with a group of children, a single unguarded moment that captured something cities rarely pause long enough to show. More than 4 decades after Dorothea Lange photographed her as the face of the Great Depression, Florence Thompson held up that iconic 1936 image during an interview on the 10th of October 1978. The migrant mother, finally named, finally seen as a person rather than a symbol. A glass telephone booth in the 1980s stands as a reminder of a world where a private conversation required finding the right corner, the right change in your pocket, and a door that closed behind you. Hours before the first wave of soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, the 101st Airborne's Filthy 13 volunteer pathfinders jumped into the darkness over France just after midnight, tasked with marking the drop zones that the entire Allied airborne assault depended upon. Standing beside his coracle on the Welsh shore in the early 20th century, This fisherman carried a tradition thousands of years old, a single man, a woven wooden frame, and a stretch of water between him and home. Somewhere in the 1910s, a man sat for a photograph with his donkey settled comfortably across his lap. One of those quietly joyful images that reminds us that people have always loved their animals in ways that defied any easy explanation. In 1963, New Yorkers rode the subway each morning with a newspaper folded in hand, a daily ritual of ink and transit that connected millions of strangers to the same city, the same headlines, and the same shared moment in time. On a Barcelona sidewalk in 1952, two U.S. sailors from the Sixth Fleet paused to talk with two young local women. A quietly human photograph captured by Nat Farbman of a world slowly reopening after years of war. In the summer of 1982, artist Agnes Deans planted a 2-acre wheat field on a landfill in Lower Manhattan, a golden crop growing just blocks from Wall Street, a living artwork challenging the city to think about what it had paved over. The Texas Track Club of Abilene gathered with their coach in 1964 for a photograph that captured the quiet pride of young athletes in a small American city, a team portrait from a world where sports still meant afternoons on a real track, earned together. Sitting alone in the ruins of Cologne in 1945, a woman looks out at a city reduced to rubble by years of Allied bombing, a portrait of devastation that also holds, in its stillness, the simple endurance of the people who remained. In Harlem, New York in 1948, photographer Gordon Parks turned his lens on the everyday life of a community the mainstream press rarely chose to document, an image that carries both the weight of that absence and the dignity of the people it finally showed. In 1960, a young Muhammad Ali relaxed with an in-car vinyl record player, a glimpse of the man behind the legend, at ease with music and the open road, before the world fully understood what he was about to become. In 1964, AT&T unveiled the picture phone to the world and declared that video calling was the future of communication, a vision that arrived 40 years early and found a world not yet ready to live inside it. In 1987, East Germany put computers on parade through its streets, a socialist state staging the spectacle of technological progress for its citizens, even as the system those computers were meant to celebrate had less than 3 years left to stand. At 5 years old in 1884, Albert Einstein sat for a childhood portrait that gives no hint of the theories that would one day rewrite humanity's understanding of space, time, and the fundamental nature of the universe. In 1957, a Victorian home was loaded onto a barge and floated across the water in Tiburon, California, an entire house in transit, drifting quietly past the shoreline rather than surrendering to a wrecking ball. In Dallas, Texas, in the 1940s, male car hops in shorts served customers at drive, in restaurants, a detail that reminds us that American roadside culture once had its own breezy, sun-warmed style, long before fast food erased the charm of it. On frozen canals in the Netherlands in 1919, skaters glided through a winter landscape that had carried people across its ice for centuries, a tradition as Dutch as the windmills and as old as the cold season itself. On the island of Okinawa in 1945, an American serviceman shared his rations with 2 small Japanese children, a photograph taken in the final weeks of the Pacific War in a place that had seen some of its most devastating fighting. In 1986, photographer Sebastifeo Salgado descended into the Serra Pelada gold mine in Brazil and found tens of thousands of men hauling mud by hand from a pit that had consumed an entire hillside, one of the most extraordinary and haunting images of human labor ever made. Inside a disco in communist East Germany in the 1980s, young people danced beneath the lights to music their government could not quite control, a reminder that even in the most tightly managed societies, youth has always found a way to move. In Azerbaijan in 1939, a group of shepherds gathered around a gramophone to listen to music in an open field, one of those photographs that quietly records the moment a modern technology arrived in an ancient way of life and was welcomed without ceremony. On the 7th of August, 1983, David Bowie took the stage at Edmonton's Commonwealth Stadium, midway through the Sirius Moonlight Tour, performing for a crowd that was witnessing one of the defining concert experiences of that entire decade. In 1963 at the White House, President John F. Kennedy reached out to shake the hand of a 16-year-old boy from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, two men separated by 30 years and the full arc of American history, sharing a moment neither fully understood yet. In London in the early 1900s, a mother gathered her children close for a portrait, a photograph of quiet, unannounced love from a century whose working family's history remembers mostly in statistics rather than faces. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, cosmonaut Sergei Krikalev found himself stranded aboard the Mir space station, launched from a country that no longer existed below him, waiting months for a new Russia to figure out how to bring him home. On the 3rd of November 1962, off the coast of Cornwall at Land's End, a crew member was pulled alive from the wreckage of the French fishing trawler Jean Gougy, one of only a few survivors after the vessel ran aground and took 12 men, including the skipper, to their deaths. During the construction of Rockefeller Center in 1932, workers paused for a break high above the streets of Manhattan, a moment captured by Charles C. Ebbets that shows the men who built one of New York's great landmarks resting quietly at the edge of the sky. In 1989, West Germans pressed forward at the Brandenburg Gate to face East German border guards across a barrier that had divided a city, a nation, and two opposing visions of the world for 28 years. A confrontation that would, within days, be over forever. In 1926, an astronomer peered through a telescope at the planet Mars, still a mystery, still a moving light in the sky. In the years before anyone had yet conceived of a rocket that could carry a human being toward it. In the 1950s, a magazine advertisement promoted a car-mounted baby seat that allowed parents to leave their child secured to the vehicle while they went shopping, a safety solution that later generations would recognize as anything but. In 1966, students in the United States marched in protest outside their high school after administrators demanded they cut their long hair, a small battle in a much larger cultural war over identity, conformity, and who got to decide what freedom looked like. On the 26th of September 1936, a mountain sheep on the Horseshoe Pass near Llangollen in North Wales pressed its face against a car window, begging food from a small boy inside. A photograph so perfectly timed, it has outlasted almost everything that surrounded it that day. In the 1910s, a two-horse team pulled a street cleaning machine through the avenues of New York City, sprayer, squeegee, and roller working in quiet concert down streets that the automobile was only just beginning to claim as its own. Somewhere on the American frontier in the 1870s, a family emerged from their home to pose for a photographer who had made the rare journey out to find them, arranging their largest melons and a seemingly roof-climbing cow to show the world that life out west was going just fine. In 1933, Engineers in London placed a double-decker bus at a steep tilt to demonstrate that it would not topple, a public test of structural confidence carried out in the open street before the watching eyes of a city that apparently needed convincing. In Paris in 1953, a group of schoolchildren pressed their faces against a glass with the open, unguarded curiosity that only children carry. A moment photographer Robert Doisneau caught with the same warmth and precision he brought to everything he touched. A beekeeper in the 1950s tended his hives with a pipe in his mouth and no protective veil in sight, an image of a different era's relationship with risk, when keeping bees was simply part of keeping a life. In April 1933, a crowd of Chicagoans cheered as a truck loaded with beer rolled out of a brewery, celebrating the congressional passage of a bill legalizing 3.2% beer. The first crack in Prohibition's wall before its full repeal later that year. In 1936, in Australia, motorcycles were hitched to chariots for a racing spectacle that combined ancient pageantry with modern machinery. A collision of centuries that produced one of the more improbable sporting photographs of the 1930s. Inside Foyle's bookshop in London in 1949, shelves stretched in every direction and customers moved quietly through the stacks. One of the world's great bookshops in its post-war years, a place that had survived the Blitz and was still selling stories. In 1966, photographer Robert Doisneau found a row of Parisian hairdressers working in the sun outside their salon, a small, unhurried scene of street life that his camera transformed into something too good to have been staged. On 14th Street in New York City in 1983, two boys walked with a boombox balanced on a shoulder, carrying their music out into the open air of a city where sound was never just private, photographed by Maurice Engel in the middle of a decade that made noise an art form. In wartime Britain during the 1940s, a single week's food ration for one adult was laid out for the camera, a measured arrangement of butter, sugar, meat, and tea that said everything about what it cost an entire nation to stay fed and still fight. In 1897, the London electrical cab quietly rolled through the city streets, one of the earliest electric vehicles in history, offering a glimpse of a future that the 20th century would choose to delay by more than 100 years. In 1854, a delivery of hoops for women's skirts arrived, enormous wire frames that would shape the silhouettes of the Victorian era, a fashion infrastructure as elaborate and demanding as anything the century produced. Outside a David Bowie concert in 1973, fans gathered dressed in the vivid theatrical style that Ziggy Stardust had given them permission to wear, a crowd that had come not just to hear music, but to become part of a moment that felt like it was remaking identity itself. In the 1950s, teams of cartographers worked by hand measuring, drafting, and inking maps with tools that required years of training before software arrived and made in a few hours what once took months of precise, painstaking human labor. In Innsbruck, Austria, around 1975, an elderly man was photographed on a street, a face carrying the full weight of a century that had included 2 world wars, an empire's collapse, and the slow arrival of an ordinary afternoon in a peaceful alpine city. In 1916, an ethnomusicologist played a wax cylinder recording for Mountain Chief, an elder of the Blackfoot Nation, 2 men from entirely different worlds leaning toward the same sound in an attempt to preserve songs that had never before been written down. In 1939, flour mills that had noticed women sewing their children's clothes from plain cotton sacks quietly began printing those same sacks in floral fabric. a small human active industry that asked for nothing in return and gave something dignified back. In 1970, the Lancia Stratos Zero concept car moved through the streets of Milan, a machine so radically low and angular it barely looked like something designed to carry a human being, a vision of automotive design arriving years before the roads were ready for it. In 1928, sailors hauled a newly built boat through the narrow stone streets of Port Isaac in Cornwall, England, pulling it by hand from the construction site down to the water. A town small enough that launching a vessel still required the whole community to move together. In a Pennsylvania coffee shop in 1943, photographer Esther Bubley captured the quiet in-between hours of wartime America. The booths, the cups, the ordinary pause in a life that the war had reshaped around everyone without anyone's permission. Standing beside the newly completed Transcontinental Railroad in Nevada in 1869, a Native American man looked out at the iron rails that had just crossed his continent, a presence that the official celebration photographs of that moment almost entirely chose to leave out. The first washing machine, invented in 1851 by James King, was operated entirely by hand, a labor-saving device that still required the same two arms it was built to spare, in a century where every advancement came with its own set of compromises. In Paris in 1938, Sigmund Freud walked escorted by Princess Marie and Prince George of Greece. A man in his final years, having recently fled Nazi-occupied Vienna, moving through the city he loved in the company of royalty, carrying the last of his work with him. At Ellis Island in 1905, an Italian family paused for a portrait, new arrivals in a country that had not yet decided whether it wanted them. Standing together with the particular composure of people who have already survived the journey and have no intention of turning back. In the 1960s, women pushed shopping carts through gleaming new supermarkets, navigating the same weekly errand that had always defined domestic life, now performed in fluorescent lit aisles filled with a post-war abundance that previous generations could not have imagined. In 1978, Jerry Stiller brought his teenage son Ben to a play, a father and son out for a night of theater, photographed before the world knew that the quiet boy at his side would one day become one of the most recognized faces in American comedy. In County Galway around 1890, an Irish woman worked her spinning wheel outside her cottage door, a craft unchanged for centuries, practiced here at the edge of the Atlantic in a country where tradition and hardship had long kept company with one another. On a snowy road in northern Maine in 1930, a school bus carried its cargo of children through a landscape that offered no concessions to winter. A photograph of rural American education in an era when getting to school was itself a kind of achievement. A 1970s vision of the office of the future imagined the typist wearing a headset surrounded by electronic equipment, a prediction so confident in its own accuracy that it couldn't quite see the personal computer already being assembled in a California garage just a few years away. At Kitty Hawk in 1902, one of the Wright brothers ran along the dunes guiding their glider through the air, a year before the engine, a year before the flight that changed everything, practicing the physics of lift with patience and string and wind. In the 1920s, a gentleman paused to tip his hat to a group of passing ladies, a gesture so commonplace in its time and so thoroughly vanished from ours that the photograph now reads as a small formal record of a courtesy the world quietly retired. From the back of a hand cart in 1925, a vendor sold bread through the streets, an economy of daily bread still being moved by hand and wheel through a city, already filling with automobiles, carrying an older way of life a little further down the block. On the 17th of March, 1973, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sturm walked across the tarmac at Travis Air Force Base and was met by his family rushing toward him. A photograph of reunion that became one of the most celebrated images of the Vietnam War's long homecoming. In 1935, Patadong women visiting London from Burma sat in a hotel room playing cards, travelers from a world so different from the one outside the window that the photograph reads as 2 centuries occupying the same afternoon without quite understanding each other. On the 14th of December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese American Citizens League opened the Anti-Axis Committee office in a deliberate public act, declaring the loyalty of American-born Japanese citizens at the precise moment their country had begun to doubt it. On the 15th of September 1989, former President Ronald Reagan removed his baseball cap at a Rochester, Minnesota airport to reveal a partially shaved head, a quiet, unguarded moment between surgeries that reminded a watching public how quickly the office and the man inside it could both change. In 1927, a pig wandered into the frame of a wedding photograph and became the most memorable guest, a moment of perfect, unplanned comedy, preserved at a time when photographs were still rare enough that every one of them was supposed to matter. In 1975, a couple exchanged wedding vows at a McDonald's restaurant, a ceremony that was either a charming act of personal honesty or a sign of things to come, depending entirely on which decade you are reading this from.